Well, friends, we've had the blessing of lots of babies born to different brothers and sisters at church in 2016, and I hope that that trend of natural church growth will continue throughout this year. But this morning I want you to cast your mind back to your own birth. And I want to ask you, who came to visit when you were born? Who came to visit when you were born? I was born in 1977 in Korea. I obviously can't remember anything about the birth and who was there, but I imagine my extended family came to visit. Perhaps some of my parents' friends came to the hospital on that day. But that's about the extent of it, really. As far as I know, the President of the United States didn't get on a plane to come and see this glorious birth. The cast of Star Wars, which I think was released in 1977, didn't come to pay homage to this wonderful baby. In fact, I don't think anyone rich or famous came to visit me in hospital. Did anyone have anyone notable come and visit them? Yeah, I didn't think so. Now, it seems a little bit silly to think that such significant people would go out of their way to go and visit a baby that they had absolutely no connection with. But in today's passage, one of the striking things is that is exactly what happens with the birth of Jesus. You notice there that some distinguished people, as we heard in the kids' talk, called wise men, come to visit at the birth of this baby. Why would these men go to such lengths to see this child, I wonder? Now, who were these men who visited the baby Jesus? Well, in the popular imagination, they were three kings who came from the Orient. So hands up if you've heard the Christmas song, "We Three Kings of Orient Are." We've all heard the song, and that drives the popular view, I think. But in the Bible, we're not actually told that they were kings, although we can probably guess that they were wealthy by the kind of gifts they bring and the fact that they were able to travel long distances. But we're not told that they were kings. Nor are we told that there were three of them. We just make that assumption because, well, there were three gifts. But as you know, you don't need three people to give three gifts. I received three presents from one person before. And sometimes I've received one present from 50 people who don't want to spend a lot of money. But if you have a look at verse 1 in the passage this morning, you'll notice that they are described as wise men from the east. Wise men from the east. Now, we don't know exactly who these wise men were. In the Old Testament, you actually meet some wise men who operate outside of Israel. Does anyone know where we see wise men in the Old Testament? Just throw up your hand if you can remember where you see wise men in the Old Testament. No one? Thanks, Luke. Okay, I'll take your word for it. I didn't think of that. In Proverbs. Okay. There were wise men there. Jason? In Egypt, yeah. What happens in Egypt?
So Pharaoh has his wise men sorcerers.
Yeah, so you remember in Egypt, Pharaoh calls on his wise men who are able to practice magic and sorcery and who are even called in to interpret his dreams. There's one other place in the Old Testament where we see wise men. You want to have a guess? Yep, Tom? Yeah, in Babylon. And what happens in Babylon? Yeah, so the king of Babylon calls in his wise men to come and interpret his dream. So it's likely that these wise men were people who practiced magic and were called in to interpret dreams and things like that. They were also most probably into astrology, for you'll see there that they see a star and they recognize that the King of the Jews has been born. We're not told what kind of star this was, and there's been endless speculation as to what they actually saw. We're not told how they made the connection between the star and the birth of the King of the Jews, but in some extraordinary way, these men connect this star with the birth of the Jewish Messiah, and they recognize that this baby that is born, this Jewish king, has significance not only for the nation of Israel, but for them as well, people who live outside of Israel. And so they go to the capital city of Jerusalem to find out exactly where this baby is born, not only just to visit him, but notice, so they can worship him. But friends, notice that not everyone is as pleased about the birth of Jesus as these wise men. We're told in verse 1 that Jesus was born in the days of Herod the king. Unlike Jesus, Herod wasn't a legitimate Jewish king with royal ancestry, as we've seen in the genealogy of Jesus. He was a puppet king who was installed by the Romans to rule a part of Israel called Judea. But you can see there that when Herod hears from the wise men about the birth of the one they call King of the Jews, well, he doesn't receive the news very well, does he? And so if you have a look at verse 3, look at what Matthew says in verse 3. He says, when Herod the king heard this, that is, heard about the birth of the King of the Jews, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, why would all of Jerusalem be troubled at the birth of this baby? Why would all of Jerusalem be troubled at the birth of this baby? Well, it's because the people of Jerusalem know from bitter experience that Herod is a paranoid king. When Herod hears of anyone who is a potential rival to his rule, then people know that dreadful things can happen. And the one who has just been born is called the King of the Jews. I mean, this was a man who had previously slaughtered his very own wife and his mother-in-law and his 3 children, his 3 sons, because he thought that they would be a threat to his rule and his power. In fact, he was so neurotic that historians of the day tell us that when Herod was on his deathbed, he actually ordered the massacre of the notable or influential men in Jerusalem, so that the moment he died, the city would be in mourning rather than rejoicing. And so you can see why Herod and the people are troubled. And you can see what Herod intends to do with this baby. It's just that at this stage, he doesn't quite know where this King of the Jews has been born. It's quite obvious from this passage that he doesn't know his Bible very well. And so you can see there in verse 4 that he calls in the religious leaders to advise him and the wise men on where the Christ, which is the Jewish title for the King of the Jews, on where this Christ was to be born. Who were these religious leaders? Well, you can see there in verse 4, can't you, that they were chief priests and scribes. The priests were the ones who served in the temple. The scribes were the legal experts in the law of God in particular and the Old Testament in general. And you can see there that when Herod asked them where the Christ is to be born, well, they know immediately the answer to that question. He's going to be born in the little city of Bethlehem. Verse 5, have a look with me at verse 5. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, friends, Bethlehem was a bit of a nowheresville in Israel. It was a little bit like the suburb of Forestville in Sydney. Has anyone been to Forestville before? Some of us have been there. It's a sleepy little suburb in the north of Sydney that's surrounded by bigger suburbs. As far as I can work out, nothing much happens in Forestville. They're kind of stuck in the dark ages. There are a few shops, but that's about it, I think. But Forestville does have a claim to fame. Does anyone know what Forestville's claim to fame is? No? Anyone? No? Well, I'll tell you. It's the place where Tony Abbott, the previous Prime Minister, lives. That's its only claim to fame. The only notable thing about this suburb is its connection with a famous Prime Minister. And Bethlehem was a little bit like that. It was a bit of a nowheresville. No one really took much notice. But it was the place where King David, one of the greatest, possibly the greatest king in Israel's history, was born. And many years before the birth of Jesus, the prophet Micah predicted that the Christ, or the Messiah, would come from this town, this little sleepy town called Bethlehem. And the religious leaders knew it. And so there we have it. Matthew introduces us to three characters who all respond in different ways to the King of the Jews, to Jesus who was born. You have the wise men, you have Herod, and you have the religious leaders. And friends, I want to suggest to you this morning that the way these characters respond to Jesus is exactly the same way that people respond to Jesus today. I mean, think about the sheer indifference of the religious leaders for a moment. Oh yes, they know their Bibles. They can even quote the Bible when prompted. But what do they do with this knowledge? They don't even bother to go and search for the king that they knew was born in the town of Bethlehem. Now, I think that many people who are in our churches respond to Jesus like this, don't they? They are religious. They might have been attending church for many, many years. They might even be able to quote the Bible to you. And yet when Jesus makes demands on their life, well, they refuse to be bothered. I wonder whether you or I respond to Jesus in this way. Or think about the bitter hostility of Herod. Here is a man who refuses to allow Jesus to rule his life. He will not tolerate any other king but himself. Again, you see this kind of hostility towards Jesus in our world, don't you? Now, I know that not all people who claim to be atheists are like this. But there is a brand of atheism that rages against religion in general and Christianity in particular. Listen to what Friedrich Nietzsche, who represent a lot of modern-day atheists, wrote in the late 1800s. It's coming up on the screen behind me. He writes, I call Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity. I call it the one immortal blemish of mankind. What would cause a man to display such hostility towards Christianity? Could it be that they are feeling threatened by Jesus? Could it be that they know that this king challenges their way of life and their way of thinking and their system of morality? They do not like the idea of giving up their pretend kingship to the Lord Jesus Christ. And so they lash out in hostility. Have you known people who respond to Jesus like this? Perhaps we might respond to Jesus like this at times. Can we take the slide down, Robert? But friends, then there are the wise men, aren't there? It's ironic, isn't it, that Herod and the religious leaders of Israel, who should have recognized the Christ or the Messiah that was predicted to come in their own scriptures, it's ironic, isn't it, that they are the ones who fail to respond to him in the right way, and yet it is these wise men from outside of Israel who travel vast distances to come and worship the King of the Jews. Somehow they recognize that in Jesus, God's blessing will come not only to the nation of Israel, but in fact to the nations. And so when they find out where he is born, they travel to Bethlehem. And listen to how they respond in verse 10. I think this is one of my favorite verses in this passage. Verse 10, it says, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. It's kind of over-the-top kind of language, isn't it? How many times can you emphasize joy? And you know the story. When they see Jesus, they fall at his feet in worship, and they bring their expensive gifts, and they lavish these gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh and offer it to their king. You see, friends, this is what worship of Jesus looks like, doesn't it? It looks like giving up our time to search for Jesus, just as these wise men did. It looks like being inconvenienced in travelling such a great distance just because they want to know this one called the King of the Jews. It means giving the best we have to offer, not just the scraps in our lives, because we understand how precious and worthy is this King. It means letting Jesus shape how we use our days and how we use our minds and how we use our wallets. It means letting Jesus be King in our lives. I don't know how everyone here has responded to Jesus in 2016. I imagine we all responded to him in slightly different ways. But as we begin 2017, God's word challenges us here, doesn't it? Will we recognize and rejoice in our King? Will we give him the best of our time and our energy and our money and the things that we value, because in Jesus we know God's blessing has come to us? Will we engage in this kind of extravagant worship as we begin 2017? Now, friends, You'll notice there that chapter 2, verses 1 to 12 is really all about the response of the wise men to King Jesus. And in many ways, we could stop the sermon there, can't we? But I'm sure you noticed the threat to Jesus' life that has been building and building from the beginning. Herod wants the wise men to search for Jesus, and then he wants the wise men to bring back word about where the baby is, so that he can, quote in his own words, also go and worship him. But we are told later that his intention is not to worship Jesus, but to destroy him. And so when the wise men don't return after being warned in a dream, well, you'll notice there that Herod goes into a rage. What is the extent of this rage? Well, you see the extent there in verse 16, don't you? In the unspeakable atrocity of murdering all the baby boys in the town of Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, in the hope of eliminating Jesus. Verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. You see, here we have a human ruler with all the power at his disposal, trying to destroy the Christ, who is only an infant boy at this stage. I mean, it shouldn't have been so hard, don't you think? But I want you to notice two very important things about this threat to Jesus' life. Firstly, notice that God is at work protecting this child from harm. Notice that God is at work protecting this child from harm. In verse 13, he sends an angel to Joseph, warning him in advance that Herod is about what Herod is going to do, and he instructs him to take Jesus and Mary down to Egypt in order to dodge the danger. I find it fascinating that the angel keeps on using the phrase, the child and his mother. He doesn't say the mother and child, he says the child and his mother. The focus here is on preserving this child. And again, in verse 19, a similar thing happens. By this time, Herod is dead, and so God speaks to Joseph in Egypt through an angel, instructing him to take the child and his mother and return to Israel. But because Herod's son, Archelaus, is reigning in the place of his father, God speaks to Joseph in a dream and tells him to not live in the town of Bethlehem, because the danger is still real there, but to go and live further north in a town called Nazareth, which is in the Gentile region of Galilee. But secondly, I want you to notice that the things that happen here fulfill God's purposes in the Old Testament. You may have noticed that Matthew keeps on repeating the language of fulfillment in this passage. Verse 15, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Verse 17, then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. Verse 23, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled. Now, at times, the fulfillment of God's promises in the Old Testament is fairly straight. In verse 6, haven't we, that Micah predicts that the Christ or the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. That's the prediction. And we see in this passage the fulfillment. That's exactly what happens. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. And so you know that God has kept his promise. His word has been fulfilled. It's a bit like putting on, your favourite pair of jeans. It just kind of fits nicely, doesn't it? God predicts something is going to happen, and it happens exactly as he predicted it would. But if you are a careful reader of the Bible, you may have noticed that when Matthew speaks of fulfillment in this passage, it doesn't always work in that straightforward, nice-fitting kind of way. Did you notice that? And so, for example, in verse 15, the context is the angel has told Joseph to take his family down to Egypt. And in verse 15, notice that Matthew quotes from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, where it says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." Out of Egypt I called my son. But if you read Hosea, in the passage that is being quoted here, God is not explicitly talking about the future coming of the Messiah. He's just recounting the fact that in the past, he saved the nation of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And so how does Jesus going down to Egypt fulfill Hosea chapter 11, verse 1? It kind of feels like Matthew is doing a bit of a fudge here in some ways. It feels like, putting on those same pair of jeans after Christmas lunch. It doesn't kind of fit as well, and you have a little bit of a muffin top going, and it's a bit of a fudge. I wonder whether you can just turn to the person sitting next to you and just discuss how you think this fulfills Hosea 11:1. Just exercise your minds for a moment with the person sitting next to you. Okay, that's enough time. What do you think? How does what is happening with Jesus and his family going down to Egypt? How does that fulfill Hosea chapter 11, verse 1? Anyone have any thoughts? Yeah, that's certainly true. I'm not sure how that explains the fulfillment that's going on here, according to Matthew, but that's certainly true. So Israel, the history of Israel, was a little bit of a picture of what was going to happen later on. That's really helpful, and I think that's the key to understanding this kind of fulfillment. You see, not all fulfillment in the Bible is the straightforward, God predicts something and it happens exactly as he predicted kind of fulfillment. It's not like, putting... this is one of my youngest daughter's jigsaw puzzles. And you'll notice there that it's got a few missing pieces. But you know as well as I do that when you do a jigsaw puzzle, it's not only about finding a piece that fits the shape. If you do a jigsaw puzzle that's slightly bigger than that, you'll actually find that lots of pieces can fit the shape. But what is the way to complete the jigsaw puzzle? Well, you need to find a piece that not only fits the shape, but fits the pattern. And so you need to find a piece that has the face of, what's her name? Queen Elsa, Princess Anna, and you have to have a piece that fits the actual pattern of what is going on in the picture. And I think the fulfillment of God's word is very similar. The Old Testament gives you the story or the pattern, and Jesus fulfills perfectly that story or that pattern. And so what's going on with Hosea chapter 11? Well, Hosea 11 talks about the Exodus. And the Exodus was the time when Israel was oppressed by the king of Egypt called Pharaoh. Here, in this passage, we see Jesus being oppressed by another evil king called Herod. In the Exodus, Israel passes through the river Jordan and is tested in the wilderness, if you remember. Later on, in Matthew's Gospel, we will see that Jesus passes through water as well in the baptism of John the Baptist, and he will be tested himself by Satan. Only this time, Jesus will not sin like the people of Israel did back in the Exodus. In other words, friends, what we see in Jesus is a new Exodus. And this son will be the perfect son that Israel never was. Matthew is saying, look at the pattern of Israel's history and then look at Jesus and see that he is the one who fits the pattern perfectly. In him there is hope of a new Exodus where God's people can experience true freedom, not just from an earthly evil king, but true freedom from Satan and from death and sin. Now, we don't have time to go through all the instances of God fulfilling his promises in this passage, and perhaps you might want to have a chat about some of the other instances that you see there. But what this shows us is that God is a God who keeps his promises. It's an extraordinary thing, don't you think, that the God who created the heavens and the earth is the same God who makes promises to his people. He promises to bless them. He promises to save them from their sins. He promises to be with them and to rule over them as their gracious King. And in Jesus, all these promises are fulfilled. Friends, we live in a world of broken promises, don't we? As we begin a new year, I'm sure that we'll begin to make all sorts of promises to ourselves and to other people around us. I've already promised that I'll do more exercise in 2017, and I know that it's only a matter of time till I break that particular promise. And many of our promises are like that. We can kind of live with a certain amount of broken promises. But broken promises can also be devastating. The broken promises in a marriage, for example. The broken promises of parents to their children. The broken promises in politics and those in power. Broken promises can destroy and shatter relationships because broken promises shatter trust. But what God is reminding us of here is that he is a God who keeps his promises. In Jesus, all God's promises find their fulfillment. He is the son of Abraham. He is the son of David. His name is Jesus, who will save his people from their sins. He is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Matthew is saying, look at him. Look at this one who is born King of the Jews. Do you see in him the one who fulfills all his promises to his people? And if you do recognize that he is that one, then worship him. Fall at his feet, rejoicing like these wise men. Offer him the best of your gifts, for he is worth everything. Let's pray.